to ask questions direct to one speaker or to another one. Can all of the speakers hear me? Yeah? Yeah, okay, thank you. So basically, all of this was a discussion on global need, an urgent need to have modern decisions implementation. Also, we have a very specific time frame, as Stefan pointed out. Obviously, some more optimistic approaches on what can we do. I guess the general question to start is, from your experience, how do you see the stakeholders' involvement when you present this evidence, all this information? I don't know, perhaps we can start with Stefan? Oh.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have had very limited experience with stakeholders. Probably the main one was in my role as an advisor to the German government as part of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. And yeah, my experience has been not entirely positive, because we basically noticed that the politicians like to take scientific advice when it fits their agenda. And if it doesn't, they prefer to ignore it. So, well, that's maybe too pessimistic. I think in the long run, scientific advice does make a difference. And I mean, without it, we wouldn't have a Paris Agreement, for example. But I think it would be naive to think that you just present the scientific evidence and then policymakers or stakeholders are going to act on it. That it actually requires a lot more, including public pressure, I think, by groups like activists, Fridays for Future, etc., to get things moving. I mean, we have had the first official government report about global warming in 1965 for the US President Lyndon B. Johnson, and it took a full 50 years from that point to reach the Paris Agreement. And now we're running out of time. So sorry, I can't give a more optimistic message.
Well, thank you very much for your intervention. Anna, you had your hand raised, so perhaps you can add on that.
Yes, I interact with stakeholders all the time, and they vary from national governments to small industry associations, NGOs, all sorts. And I think the easiest way to communicate is to first listen and try to understand what they need and what they want from whatever it is the conversation that you're having. And so it's important that you approach a stakeholder and you're already speaking a language that matches well with what resonates with them. And so our approach here has been to move away from just doing the science by ourselves, but actually bringing them in when we're designing the research, so that the products that are coming out are already being tailored to the audience that you want to grasp. Now, that's not always possible. And so when you work with, international working groups and so forth in academia, then that's not always the case, and that's not always necessary. But and so then you can hit these barriers where, yeah, you come with you have found a new knowledge, and then you're presenting it for the first time. And so in my opinion, yeah, it's this work that we have to do in the background where we try to understand, okay, so where is the closest point where I can meet the stakeholder in their language and in their needs, and then produce a product that translates my science to that meeting point. So that would be my 2 cents, if you like.
Thank you very much. And perhaps Carlos could pitch in.
Well, that's a very encompassing question that you ask, but if we can parse that question into audiences. So if the stakeholders are communities, for instance, when you discuss with them options to activate nature-based solutions, they're always very receptive, because they're the main beneficiaries of the adaptive benefits that the nature-based solutions came about, but also more broadly of all the SDGs. So communities are often very supportive, and in fact, they must be engaged in deployment of these actions, because as the projects are not sustainable, because they need to be maintained across generations. So that's a commitment that governments cannot adopt, only communities can. When you engage with governments, again, depending on the forum, and that changes with geographies. So then you meet with a lot of skepticism, and if you want, even cynicism from policymakers, because they're really looking at short-term pictures. And but when you talk also with the private sector, they're far more engaged than governments, because private sectors are increasingly committed with sustainable development goals, because even their future in terms of investability on their businesses depends not only on the profitability, but their contribution to achieve sustainable development goals. So they see it as an important metric, an important KPI, and either forced by market and invest in opportunities, or either because of their own commitments, they are quite willing to engage. So it'll be great to see them more active in biodiversity conservation, and then at least as active as they are in climate action now. And lastly, there's the scientific community, which is the one that we are addressing today. And in the scientific community, I find that when we discuss climate action and climate solutions, most scientists tend to have a favorite tool, and then they try to champion that tool against others, thinking that this is a zero-sum game. So that if resources are going to go to one particular solution, that means that they're going to be removed from being accessible to deploy their favorite solution. So they try to engage in all kinds of battles to try to come up with a winning solution. But both in our biodiversity and climate action needs, we don't have a silver bullet. We need to activate all actions. And for instance, in the previous question, I was asked about the relatively small scale of blue carbon solutions. And most people say that if any particular climate action cannot remove 1 petagram of carbon, then it's not worth activating. But in fact, there are no low-hanging petagrams out there. So we need to activate all solutions, and every bit of what we can do counts, particularly when it delivers value-added benefits.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for that. So now, John.
Sure. I mean, I also agree that it's a very complex question. For sure, stakeholder involvement is becoming more and more crucial in European projects. I mean, when we are submitting proposals now, even in the text of the call, we see stakeholder involvement. There are working packages just dedicated to stakeholder involvement. And from our experience, there and even at national level, the relationship is, I have mixed feelings, because the relationship is very good. I mean, we see in the field that stakeholders are talking about, for example, these scuba diving centers or marinas or ports administration. They want to collaborate, but at the same time, they are tired of being bombed by researchers with questionnaires and about these things. And I'm afraid of their commitment because of these. Because they're getting exhausted. So maybe we need a better strategy, and maybe this should be more European level. But each country has their own problems, and I have no solution. I think it's complex. It's a very complex question.
So perhaps we can take in any questions from the audience, specifically. About this or anything. We can open up the discussion to anything you wish to have.
No, I don't think you see me, Carlos. It's a Pinto, and I would like to ask you to comment, because you showed a little bit in one of your figures, but what do you think could be the role of seaweed cultivation in this, increasing the biomass, not the natural biomass, this is the cultivated biomass, but do you think it could have a role in this climate change mitigation, in getting the carbon out of the atmosphere?
Microphone, Carlos.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. And in fact, I just completed coordinating a global study of carbon sequestration with seaweed farming, that we hope to publish soon. So that was a study that we conducted during the pandemic, which made it quite painful to do because we engaged 20 seaweed farms across 18 nations. And many of them were under severe lockdown, like China and Japan. So it was hard to complete the study. But the bottom line is that we calculated, and that is not an estimate, it's not a calculation, actually empirical estimates, looking at carbon sequestration in the seafloor below seaweed farms, that they sequester on average about 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide per hectare. The range is quite broad, so it's up to 8 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, but which will put then seaweed farms, or the soils below seaweed farms, in the same league as mangroves and seagrass. But none of these farms were ever designed to sequester carbon. So I think there's an opportunity to expand seaweed farming, not only to sequester carbon in particular settings that are suitable to do that, but also to generate products that are going to contribute across many SDGs to alleviate hunger and other problems that we are facing. But currently, seaweed farms extend to 2,000 square kilometers globally. 96% of that is in Asia. About 4% is in Africa, and almost nothing is in Europe. So for us in the Western world, seaweed farming is a new business and one that is very, very small industry in Europe, but has a great potential to grow. And just to provide a contrast, in Japan, the oldest seaweed farm that we have in our study is 300-year-old of continuous farming with different technologies, but continuous farming of seaweed. So we calculate that seaweed farming can be scaled to about 2 million square kilometers. So that's about 1,000 times the current area. And if this is done, then the potential will be maybe to sequester around 2 to 3 petagram carbon dioxide per year, while using the crop for other purposes. What we do not support, because I think it's really unethical because of the many benefits that seaweed farming can bring about to the public, is to sink seaweed in the ocean as a way of deriving carbon credits.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for that. Stefan, you have a raised hand. Would you like to intervene?
If I may, I'd like to ask a question to Carlos.
Sure. Go ahead.
Carlos, you nicely stated that ocean forests can't burn down, but can you comment on to what extent mangroves or seagrass meadows would be threatened by climate change in the form of sea level rise, ocean warming, ocean acidification?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, there's some evidence of impacts of climate change on, particularly on seagrass, not so much on mangrove. So in terms of temperature, the thermal limits of seagrass are usually, and we published that recently, are usually about 5 degrees above current maxima. So then that means that there's a scope, even under the more negative range of the Paris Agreement, for seagrass to continue to grow in the ocean. There are particular species that might be threatened, particularly Posidonia oceanica, is much closer to the thermal limit than the other species. So in the Mediterranean, we project major losses of Posidonia oceanica with further warming. But across the seagrass ecosystem globally, then they are expected to be quite resistant to climate change. In the case of mangroves, obviously they occupy a very narrow belt in the intertidal zone. So as sea level rise, they will be displaced upwards along the slope. So the scope for mangroves to be able to do that, and even to recolonize or restore former mangrove areas, depend on there being what is called accommodating space, because sometimes we're squeezing the habitat between urban developments or seawalls and a rising sea level. So there are situations and circumstances where mangroves cannot migrate upward with sea level rise, and in those areas we might see losses of mangroves, but so that we might not be able to recover the full historical extent of mangroves, also because some area has been occupied by infrastructure. But I think even considering those limitations, the scope to recovery is quite high.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Are there any other questions in the one over there?
Just giving on this idea of seaweed farming. The question is, we only sequester carbon if we don't use what we are farming. That is, if I produce wood, then if I will burn it, or if I will heat it, then the carbon goes back to the atmosphere. So if I bury the wood, then I would sequester carbon. I would ask your opinion on that, because your numbers are great, but if we bring the seaweed from the ocean, and if we, let's say, burn it in our bodies, that it's wood or something else, aren't we, emitting against CO2? Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So in fact, I probably did not explain myself well, because what the numbers I was quoting were not the biomass of seaweed, but it's actually the carbon that falls during the farming period into the sea floor and is sequestered in the sea floor, like it happens on seagrass soils as well. So this is not counting the yield. So then on top of this, there is what you do with the crop, right? So the 2 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year on average is the carbon that is sequestered in the soils under the seaweed farm. That represents about 10%, an equivalent 10% to the yield. So that means that out of the net primary production, which is about twice the yield of the seaweed farm, because you only recover half of the yield, the rest is released as POC and DOC into the ocean, and some of that is what is buried in the soil. And when you remove the crop, which is about 50% of the net primary production of the seaweed in the farm, then you can actually have options to contribute to climate change mitigation beyond that. And the scope for that is huge, because just consider that one genus of seaweed, that is Asparagopsis, has been shown to, if fed to ruminants, be able to shut down emissions of methane by about 60 to 80%. Methane emissions from ruminants represent 18% of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of CO2 equivalents. And therefore, if we are able to safely reduce emissions from ruminants, that can actually be a multiplier of up to 6-fold the amount that I quoted that nature-based solutions can deliver. Then also you can displace other products. You can produce synthetic polymers that displace synthetic polymers with seaweed that may have a long lifespan and therefore be sequestered from being exchanged with the atmosphere for a long time. You can also produce biochar, and you can also use seaweed to produce biofuels. So depending on what you do with the crop, then with the starting point of how much is sequestered in the seafloor before you harvest the crop, then the opportunities to deliver climate actions to seaweed farming then multiply.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? No.
Maybe I can make one.
I was going to ask one, so go ahead.
Well, maybe a quick one. I'll make 2 questions, because then you can decide which one you want to pick up on. But you touched upon observation technologies in different ways. I mean, from sharks before, from different type of mooring systems to understand ocean currents. What do you think is the priority in terms of observing processes in the ocean out there? Of course, for climate change, most likely we will need time series, which we have somehow, but not a lot. But what can we do in terms of new technologies and new observations that we can collect? What are the priorities you see? And connected to that, but not so much connected, is also what are the priorities in general in terms of, we are a European network of research. Where should we focus our research on?
Easy question.
And I'll start with Anna, maybe.
In my opinion, we have very good, incredible observation capability. In fact, in Europe, we are very, very fortunate. What I think is missing in terms of observation, so with the Argo Float program, which is global, and with the Earth observation capability we have in Europe, we are very fortunate in all the coordinated sampling we have in terms of in situ observations for other types of things through, for instance, ICES and HELCOM and OSPA. We are very lucky to be able to have very good observation capability. What I think is missing is the transformation of that evidence, which to an extent is huge, into products that are usable by the people that make environmental management regulations in Europe and globally. And so we do certainly have gaps. We have blind spots, for instance, in terms of carbon observations on the seafloor and so on, not just in Europe, but globally. So we have huge uncertainties around certain processes related to climate change. But I think what's more is that we are collating a lot of evidence, but it often is not transformed into products that are easily accessible to those who do environmental regulation. And so, for instance, I'm aware that, for instance, and in fact, I was involved in some of the work done as part of Copernicus to try and make some of the climate change evidence more accessible, more easy to use. So I think initiatives like that are still lacking and can have transformative impact by making that evidence more accessible. But yeah, we certainly have gaps in terms of observation, particularly with seafloor habitats. I mean, how can we know the surface of Mars better than the surface of our ocean? I mean, that's nonsensical. And when it comes to climate change, yeah, we have particular blind spots with regard to seabed processes, which related to carbon sequestration, which, if you think about it, are really the ultimate sinks of carbon that we have in our ocean that regulate our climate. So yeah, that's, I think, where I think we could invest more in.
Yeah, maybe I can comment from the ocean physics point of view. I think we have pretty good data about the temperature rise, the heat content, the sea level, the sea ice. And from those physics points that I mentioned, I think the most observational gap is really the changes in the ocean circulation. We have this monitoring with the RAPID project that must continue. We have a time series started 2004, and it's difficult to fund such an exercise, apparently. We also, in order to understand what drives changes in the ocean circulation in the Northern Atlantic, need to understand the freshwater input better, precipitation, ice melt, etc. All these components, river runoff, that dilute the ocean surface waters in the Northern Atlantic is quite poorly constrained. And then, of course, we also need the modeling in order to make sense of these observational data.
Well, if I may then add to that, then I think really what we need is an external assessment of our capabilities, because internally we seem to accept the status quo of the advance in our observation capabilities, and I believe the current state is really poor and not acceptable. So we are unable to change that. And I've been working on marine science for about 40 years. And the technology and the instruments, they still have the same look and feel. And even scuba diving is pretty much the same that Jacques Cousteau introduced. So there hasn't really been any disruptive introduction, perhaps only satellite observations introduced in marine science during my lifespan of my career. And I think that's just simply not acceptable when we see the pace of technology revolution around us. So the fact that Anna referred to that we know more from Mars than the Earth. But just to put it in context, and I think about 2 years ago, or a year ago, we all watched the landing of Mars Perseverance on the surface of Mars. And I think the delay between the event happening in the surface of Mars and us watching it on the internet was 3 minutes, right? And I don't remember the distance. I think it's 400 million kilometers between Mars and Earth, something like this. And we are yet to live stream a single image of the seafloor only 3 kilometers down without cables. So we continue to accept the status quo, and we are just busy with very incremental approaches to our technology. And it is also not encouraging that the ocean decade for, the UN decade for ocean science does not include technology advancement as one of the pillars of the decade. So that really suggests that we are not going to advance observation capabilities from our own community. We need somebody to touch us on the shoulder and say, you know, this stuff that you're doing is very good, but it's 40 years old. You probably should do something new now. And in terms of European science, when we talk about crises in climate and biodiversity, and that the window to really reverse those crises 1 decade, I think we all should be busy with working towards solutions. And we do not deliver solutions from science alone. That requires broad partnerships that we are still to build.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Jean, maybe?
Yes, just to add up, in terms of biodiversity monitoring, what I think could be missing in Europe is a standardized and coordinated platform for marine biodiversity monitoring. For sure, we have several in Europe, but it's not really coordinated. I think we are missing something like that. For sure, funding is an issue, absolutely. And this is actually well aligned with the pitch that Marco Stella did this morning, and I'm looking forward to meeting with him tomorrow in the group, because we'll be talking about this. But for example, Mare, we are part of a global network of marine monitoring, which is the Smithsonian Marine Geo Network, led by Emmett Duffy. And basically what we want to do is to try to get historic data about what is the pulse of biodiversity, and what is the real impact of climate change in marine biodiversity. And for that, we need to do long-term monitoring. And we are part of this network for 6 years, and there is not really funding involved. It's basically a coordinated approach. We meet, and we have already 100 partners in the world, and all of us do the same thing with the same approach. We go underwater, we do surveys, we do habitat mapping, we do water quality analysis at the same time across the fleet. So in one aspect, you need to do long-term monitoring, and also you need to do some experiments to test what is the impact of these drivers and pressures on marine biodiversity. And again, funding is an issue, but I think EuroMarine can definitely play a role in trying to launch this platform, let's call it this way, of long-term coordinated monitoring of marine biodiversity in Europe.
Thank you for that. Any more questions, perhaps? Okay, I do have one on the part of the nature-based solutions, and I assume obviously that by now we have quite a few roadmaps of implementation. Not sure how far along we are on that, but also how well developed do you feel are the indicators or the metrics to assess the effectiveness of these nature-based solutions? Because perhaps not just assessing to have the number, but also to communicate their importance is key. Perhaps Anna or Carlos?
I can have a go. I think, you know, the NBS we have in front of us are varied, you know, so there is not one answer to your question, and they're varied in their nature, and they're varied in their scale, and who is implementing them and who is paying for them. If we talk specifically about blue carbon, there are, you know, internationally recognized methodologies for their verification. So we have processes in place, some of them more reputable, some less reputable. But we have metrics and we have indicators and we have processes and methodologies linked to them that allow us to do that verification. When we talk about other things, sort of thing I was talking about today, about ensuring that that there are solutions that promote the adaptation capacity of species and habitats that underpin fisheries, for instance, that's much harder to do. And that's not hard to do because we don't have the evidence. So we don't have, for instance, we do have excellent modeling for these species and habitats that allow us to predict. We think, this area will be needed if you want to say to preserve your benthic habitats in a given region, and with different skill, but we have at least models that allow us to do this in most of the world. What we don't have are the policy processes that ingrain that evidence into our regulatory frameworks, and then we don't have indicators to verify that that's happening. So there is no single answer to your question. It very much depends on the type of NBS we are discussing, I would say.
Thank you for that. If there are no more questions, I would just ask a very quick one, and perhaps you could draw. You have been doing quite a few monitoring with remote sensing techniques, some of them underwater instruments, others drones too. So a lot of not just serving biodiversity, marine debris also. Have you had any experience involving local community? Because these are now instruments that are becoming a little bit more accessible, and how reliable would that be? To have some involvement on either drone footage or other filming. What is your take on that?
That's a tough question. Well, we did some work on that. We had a project. Well, actually, we had a PhD student. She just recently published a paper on remote sensing role of drones and machine learning for marine litter detection, both in the surface of the water, but also at the beach. And the results are quite promising. But we really didn't involve stakeholders in that. So basically, what we did was we did a lot of drone flights and a lot of pictures, both at the beach and also at the surface. And then, of course, there was a first phase where we did a lot of validation. So this is a bottle, and this is a bag, and this is something else. And then machine learning modeling was able to detect these classes. So I think the results were promising, especially on floating litter, because at the beach you have more noise, you have more objects, so it's more complicated. But the results are promising. But I think we are still at baby steps. We are just starting to that. In terms of involving stakeholders, what we did was we developed an app for beach litter, and for this you can actually use stakeholders, so hotel owners and at the beach, and so they actually used our app in Porto Santo Island. So it was a very small project, but the results were very satisfying. So yeah, sure.
Any more questions? No. Well, I guess. No, sorry. Right over here.
Yeah, well,
ahead, Patrice.
there was something maybe a bit technical in a sense, but I was very curious when Stefan, you mentioned about these tipping points, and I've not seen the latest paper that you mentioned, but I've seen the one before. And you mentioned also that since TOML, basically we know that some, like the AMOC, can show these different equilibrium points. Others are more obvious, like, I mean, if you lose the ice, that's clearly a tipping point. But how much do we know in terms of cascading effects of these tipping points in other for other dynamics? I mean, if you lose the ice, we know what type of feedback, positive and negative, we have, but do we have that kind of knowledge to tell us, okay, we cross these type of regimes and this will happen later?
Well, that is a very hot research topic in the tipping points community at the moment, is the interactions between the tipping points, these domino effects. And the classic one is the Greenland ice sheet melting, thereby dumping a lot of fresh water into the northern Atlantic, which could then push the Atlantic overturning circulation over its tipping point, which then, as we know from both modeling and paleoclimate evidence, would shift the tropical rainfall belts and then could push parts of the Amazon rainforest over its tipping point, and also via teleconnection through the ocean can affect the West Antarctic ice sheet. So this is like one of those tipping point cascades that is probably the most well known. But there are a number of research projects, and one of our PhD students, actually Nico Wunderling, just won a prize for his thesis on tipping point interactions.
But if I understand correctly, it's always in terms of understanding where to focus the research priority in EuroMarine. You mentioned that paleoclimate can actually help in understanding some of these consequences.
Exactly. The whole concept of tipping points and instabilities in the Atlantic Ocean circulation or the ice sheets is strongly coming from paleoclimate research, supported by paleoclimate research. Also, when I mentioned that one-sided uncertainty towards much higher sea level rise, this also comes from sediment data around Antarctica, showing how quickly in the Eemian interglacial, the Antarctic ice sheet actually decayed, and huge iceberg armadas were going around Antarctica. So we haven't, in the observational period in the last 100 or 150 years, we haven't seen any major tipping point crossed. And therefore, to actually get evidence for this really happening, not just in the models, we need to turn to paleoclimate proxy data.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah. One in the room. Here.
Listening to this round, I can imagine some of apocalyptic scenarios coming, and then talking about the stakeholder engagement, citizen involvement, and the other stakeholders as scientists. So I wonder, Stefan, especially because as a climatologist, I would say, do you have the feeling that we reach also the tipping point of policymakers to change their mind, to push them toward doing more actions or more serious ones?
I actually think we may be near a social tipping point towards much more policy action. Maybe it's a little bit from my perspective in Germany, because we have a green climate minister now pushing renewables, etc. But I think also, if you look around the world, you see that climate denialist governments like Trump or Bolsonaro or in Australia have been voted out. And we have seen the global youth movement, Fridays for Future. It has been a little bit subdued due to the corona pandemic, obviously. So not such huge mass demonstrations have been possible anymore. But I certainly notice a change in awareness, quite a big change. It's also supported by polling results. And even if you look at where do the investors put their money, the International Energy Agency in their latest report says that more than 80% of the investments into the electricity system worldwide are now going into renewables, storage and grids, exactly where they should be. So I think we are perhaps at a tipping point where climate protection is really taken seriously and taking off worldwide. And the IEA again estimates that in the latest, in 2 or 3 years, we will get over the peak of CO2 emissions worldwide, and they will start to drop. And of course, that doesn't mean they're dropping fast enough and everything. There's still a long way to go. But to me, having been in this business for more than 30 years now, actually seeing the point where the CO2 emissions are not rising anymore, but dropping would be, I think, a major reason to celebrate and to gain more optimism about us, managing to avoid a disaster in the last minute.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, so I guess I'll just take this moment to thank our speakers for their insights, their patience. I do think there are quite a few subjects here for the further discussion. So thank you very much for this, and for everyone in the room, there's a coffee break now, okay? So thank you very much.
The picture.
Oh, wait, there's an announcement. Okay, before the coffee break, we'll take a picture. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, everyone.
Not with you on the online, I'm sorry. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steph.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.